This is the story of how roughly 500,000 people built a weapon that most of them never knew they were building, and how a $2 billion secret changed what it meant to be at war. What follows is how that happened, who made it happen, and why historians are still arguing about what it meant 80 years later. On the 16th of July, 1945, in a stretch of New Mexico desert, the Spanish had named the Jornada del Muerto, or the Journey of the Dead Man. A steel tower held a device the scientists working on it simply called the Gadget. At 29 minutes past 5 in the morning, Mountain War time, that device unleashed energy equal to roughly 24.8 kilotons of TNT, according to the most recent re-evaluation. The men who built it had no certainty it would work at all. Some of them wagered on the yield the night before, with predictions running from 0 all the way to 45 kilotons, and a smaller group placed a far stranger bet on whether the explosion might ignite the atmosphere itself and end all life on Earth. None of that is dramatization. Enrico Fermi, one of the finest physicists of the 20th century, genuinely offered odds on that atmospheric question in the hours before the test, and the calculation said such an outcome was nearly impossible. That single word, nearly, carried an enormous amount of weight in the darkness of that desert. By the time this project delivered its final product, the cost had climbed somewhere between $1.845 and $2.2 billion in 1940s money. The workforce had swelled to as many as 500,000 Americans spread across more than 200 sites, and 3 nuclear devices had been produced in just a few years, all of it built on a scientific discovery barely 6 years old. To understand any of this, you have to begin not in America but in Berlin, in December of 1938. 2 chemists named Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann were bombarding uranium with neutrons when they detected something that had no business being there, and that something was barium. Barium sits far lower on the periodic table than uranium, so its presence pointed to only one conclusion, which was that the uranium atom had split apart. The explanation for what Hahn and Strassmann had witnessed arrived from Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch in the first weeks of 1939. Meitner and Frisch worked out the underlying theory and gave the process the name we still use, fission, and shortly afterward Niels Bohr and John Wheeler formalized the idea through the liquid drop model of the nucleus. Physicists across the world grasped the implications almost at once. Splitting one atom released energy, and if that split also flung out neutrons capable of splitting further atoms, then a self-sustaining chain reaction became possible, and with it an almost unimaginable release of power. One man had already pictured this years earlier. Leo Szilard conceived of the nuclear chain reaction as a pure idea back in 1933, long before anyone had cracked an atom open in a laboratory. By 1939, Szilard understood the danger with a sharpness that genuinely frightened him. Fission had emerged from Germany, the same Germany that within months would send its armies into Poland, and Szilard reasoned that if such a bomb could be built, the very men who discovered fission might build it first. That fear drove him to do something that would echo across the rest of the century, which was to draft a letter. History remembers it as the Einstein letter, yet the physics and the dread behind it belonged to Szilard. Working alongside 2 fellow Hungarian émigré physicists, Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner, Szilard prepared the draft and then carried it to the most famous scientist alive for a signature. Albert Einstein's name gave the document its gravity, and the letter carried the date of the 2nd of August, 1939. That letter warned President Franklin Roosevelt that uranium could become a new and important source of energy, and that this development might lead to extremely powerful bombs of a new type. An economist named Alexander Sachs, rather than any scientist, finally carried the message into Roosevelt's presence in October of 1939, and the modest result was the Advisory Committee on Uranium, a first cautious step wrapped in bureaucracy. The popular version of events stumbles right here on the question of pace. We tend to imagine the letter striking like a thunderclap, with the whole project springing instantly to life, and that simply is not what occurred. For nearly 2 years the American effort limped along, underfunded and uncertain, and what finally changed the tempo came not from American alarm but from a British report. In July of 1941, The British MAUD committee concluded that a bomb was not merely possible in theory but achievable within roughly 2 years. James Conant received the final Maud report on the 3rd of October, 1941, and here sits a detail that most retellings leave out entirely. The name Maud often gets expanded into a grand military acronym, Military Application of Uranium Detonation, and that expansion is pure myth. The real name came from a garbled telegram mentioning a woman called Maud Ray, who turned out to be Niels Bohr's former housekeeper, which means one of the most important documents in nuclear history was named, essentially by accident, after a domestic employee. The MAUD report lit a fire beneath the Americans. On the 9th of October, 1941, Roosevelt approved accelerating the program and assembled a small top policy group, and on the 18th of December, 1941, only 11 days after Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into the war, the reorganized S1 section held its opening meeting. The slow years had ended. Here lies the contrarian truth buried at the core of the whole endeavor, the fact that vanishes beneath the familiar image of Oppenheimer at his blackboard. This was never primarily a physics project. Overwhelmingly, it was an industrial construction project, and while popular memory places the theoretical physicists at the center, the budget tells a very different story. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of the money went not toward designing a weapon but toward raising enormous industrial plants and manufacturing fissile material, while less than 10 to 20% funded the actual bomb design. The true genius here was not, for the most part, a genius of theory. It was a genius of engineering, procurement, and raw industrial scale, the capacity to build from nothing, in secret, during a world war, the largest factories on Earth for producing substances that had never existed in usable quantities before. The man who understood this reality and ran the whole operation held no scientific degree at all. In September of 1942, command passed to Colonel Leslie Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who was promoted to Brigadier General very shortly afterward. Groves had just finished overseeing construction of the Pentagon. Blunt, demanding, and disliked by many of the scientists beneath him, Groves was precisely the sort of man who could drag a physics possibility into industrial reality, and it was Groves who chose J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead the weapons laboratory. Many considered that choice bizarre, given that Oppenheimer held no Nobel Prize and carried a thin administrative record, yet it became one of the most consequential personnel decisions of the entire war. Geography handed the project its name. Because the first headquarters stood in Manhattan, at 270 Broadway in New York City, the whole enterprise became known as the Manhattan Engineer District, and its official code name was blander still, Development of Substitute Materials. The most world-altering weapons program ever attempted was deliberately christened to sound like the dullest thing imaginable, and that dullness was entirely the point. Mid-August of 1942 saw the Manhattan Engineer District formally established, with a general order issued on the 13th and taking effect on the 16th, and Colonel James Marshall served as the first district engineer. The real story, though, unfolds across 3 secret cities and 1 converted squash court in Chicago. Before you can build a bomb, you first have to prove that a controlled chain reaction is even achievable, and that proof arrived in one of the least likely settings imaginable, beneath the abandoned football stands of the University of Chicago, inside a converted squash court, in the depth of winter. Leading the effort was Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist who had fled fascist Italy because his wife was Jewish, and who ranked among the greatest experimental physicists who have ever lived. At the University of Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory, Fermi's team stacked graphite blocks and uranium into a structure they named Chicago Pile 1, effectively the world's first nuclear reactor, assembled entirely by hand in a room designed for nothing of the kind. On the 2nd of December, 1942, Fermi's team eased the control rods out and achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction in human history. Accounts differ slightly on the exact moment, with some placing the rod withdrawal at 25 minutes past 3 in the afternoon and the official corrected time listed as 3:36, yet the significance stood beyond any dispute. For the very first time, Humanity had initiated and controlled a nuclear chain reaction. Word traveled up the chain through a coded telephone call now legendary for its understatement. Arthur Compton rang James Conant and reported that the Italian navigator had landed in the New World. Conant asked how the natives were, and Compton answered that they were very friendly. The Italian navigator, naturally, was Femi, the New World was the atomic age, and the natives, meaning the physics itself, had indeed proven friendly. The question was no longer whether a chain reaction could happen, but how to produce, at industrial scale, the two materials capable of sustaining an explosive one, enriched uranium and plutonium. Answering that question required building 3 cities. The first city rose in the hills of eastern Tennessee, and on paper it did not exist. Known within the project as the Clinton Engineer Works, or simply Site-X, Oak Ridge existed to enrich uranium. Natural uranium consists overwhelmingly of the isotope uranium-238, while the fissile isotope a bomb demands, uranium-235, makes up less than 1% of the total, and separating those two isotopes, chemically identical and differing only slightly in mass, ranks among the hardest industrial problems ever tackled. Oak Ridge attacked that problem through several methods at once, housed inside buildings of nearly incomprehensible size. Its centerpiece was the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant. Upon its completion in 1944, K-25 stood as the largest building in the world, enclosing more than 5,264,000 square feet of floor space, which translates to over 489,000 square meters. 4 stories tall, shaped like an enormous U, and stretching roughly half a mile in length, K-25 together with its post-war companion K-27 cost somewhere near $480 million. More than 25,000 workers labored on it at the height of construction, and around 12,000 ran it once operations began. Standing beside K-25 was Y-12, the electromagnetic separation plant, which relied on devices called colutrans, a name drawn from California University cyclotron, the invention of Ernest Lawrence at Berkeley. Inside Y-12 sat 1,152 colutrans, and across 1944 and 1945, they yielded roughly 140 pounds of uranium-235, just about enough for a single bomb. The sheer scale of Oak Ridge as a place is hard to hold in the mind. Its population crested near 75,000 people in May of 1945, with roughly 82,000 employed at the Clinton Engineer Works, and this single city drew about $1.19 billion of the project's funding, which came to roughly 63% of the total. Its appetite for electricity defies easy belief, because by 1943 estimate Oak Ridge alone consumed close to 1% of all the electrical power generated across the United States. A city absent from every map was quietly burning through 1% of the nation's electricity, and this is exactly where the human story turns stranger than the familiar picture of physicists at their chalkboards. Slow down here, because this piece of the story rarely sits at the center where it belongs. Those 1,152 colutrans at Y-12, separating uranium atom by atom, were not run by physicists at all. They were operated mostly by young women, around 10,000 of them, many fresh out of high school in Tennessee and the surrounding region, hired into work whose purpose nobody ever explained to them. History remembers them as the Colutran girls. Seated at panels and watching dials, trained to hold a needle within a certain range by turning knobs, they had no idea the needle tracked a stream of uranium isotopes bent by a magnetic field, and no idea their product was bound for a weapon. Their instructions amounted to a single task and a single rule, which was to keep the reading where it belonged and never ask why. And that's when something unfolded that even Ernest Lawrence reportedly never saw coming. Put to the test, the trained young women at their panels went head-to-head against the PhD physicists who understood exactly what the machines were doing, and the young women proved more efficient. They produced more, not through knowing more but through knowing less. Whenever a reading drifted, the physicists itched to investigate, to adjust, to optimize, to chase down the anomaly, while the women simply flagged the problem and kept the machine running. In a production setting, The physicist's curiosity became a liability, and the operator's discipline became an asset. Something almost unbearably strange sits inside that outcome. Thousands of young women, most not yet out of their teens, were unknowingly refining the core of the first atomic weapon, and outperforming the very men who had designed the machines, precisely because they had been kept in the dark. They discovered what they had been making the same way most of the country did, from the news, after Hiroshima. The second city settled into the high desert of southeastern Washington state, along the banks of the Columbia River, built to manufacture an element that barely existed in nature. Hanford, the Hanford Engineer Works, went by the name Site W, and it was the plutonium city. Plutonium offered a second road to a bomb, one that sidestepped the agonizing isotope separation uranium demanded, because plutonium forms inside a nuclear reactor, bred from uranium-238 as it soaks up neutrons. Producing it in militarily useful amounts required reactors on a scale never before attempted, along with a vast, cold, fast-moving source of cooling water, and the Columbia River supplied exactly that. For Hanford, the government seized roughly 780 square miles of land at a cost near $5.1 million in 1943, and the construction workforce peaked around 50,000 people, with the whole Hanford operation swallowing about 21% of the project's total cost. At its heart ran the B reactor, engineered to operate at 250 megawatts, meaning 250,000 kilowatts of thermal power, threaded with 2004 process tubes and cooled by roughly 75,000 gallons of Columbia River water every single minute. On the 26th of September, 1944, the B reactor reached criticality and became the world's first full-scale nuclear reactor, and the plutonium it and its sister reactors produced would form the explosive heart of two of the first three nuclear devices ever detonated, the Trinity gadget and the bomb that fell on Nagasaki. Two elements, two roots, two secret cities, and now a third city high on a New Mexico mesa, where all of it would be forged into a weapon. That third city stood apart from the other two. Oak Ridge and Hanford revolved around production, vast industrial machines for manufacturing materials, while Los Alamos revolved around design, the place where physics hardened into a bomb. Built on the grounds of a former ranch school atop an isolated New Mexico mesa, Los Alamos, known as Project Y, had its site approved on the 25th of November, 1942, for around $440,000. Under Oppenheimer's direction, it drew together an astonishing concentration of talent. Hans Bethe led the theoretical division, George Kistiakowsky worked the explosives, and Kenneth Bainbridge would direct the Trinity test. The roster at Los Alamos held some of the century's most brilliant physicists, many of them refugees from a Europe that had cast them out, and among them, at least one man was feeding everything he saw to the Soviet Union. The Los Alamos team confronted two fundamentally different design problems, because they held two different materials. For uranium-235, the answer stayed relatively simple, a gun-type design that fired one piece of uranium into another to assemble a critical mass, and this became the weapon codenamed Little Boy. Engineers judged the design so dependable that it was never tested before being used in war. Plutonium posed the harder puzzle. It could not survive a simple gun-type design, because it would pre-detonate, and it demanded a far more sophisticated method called implosion, which meant wrapping a sphere of plutonium in precisely shaped explosive lenses that would crush it inward, perfectly symmetrical, into a critical mass within a fraction of a second. The margin for error came to almost nothing, and this was the design that had to be tested. This was the gadget, and this was Trinity. Before reaching that desert, though, we have to talk about the man passing secrets, because the project's obsession with secrecy, the obsession that shaped 500,000 lives, failed completely in one crucial way. The entire operation ran on a principle Groves enforced without mercy: compartmentalization, the doctrine of need to know. Most workers, and even most scientists, understood only their own narrow slice of the work. The Calutran girls had no idea what they refined, and the Oak Ridge workforce had no idea what Oak Ridge was for. Billboards around the secret cities carried warnings that whatever you saw here and whatever you did here should stay here. The secrecy ran total, obsessive, and enforced from the very top, and none of it mattered, because the leak sat on the inside, at the highest level of the science. Klaus Fuchs was a German-born theoretical physicist who had fled the Nazis, taken British citizenship, and landed at Los Alamos in the very center of the theoretical effort. Fuchs was also a committed communist, and throughout his time on the project he handed detailed technical information, especially about the implosion design of the plutonium bomb, the hardest-won secret of the whole endeavor, to the Soviet Union through a courier named Harry Gold. Others passed material too, among them Theodore Hall and David Greenglass, but Fuchs did the most damage. The compartmentalization that ruled the lives of thousands of ordinary workers could do nothing against a trusted physicist cleared for the most sensitive work in the project. Exposure came only after the war, through the Venona decrypts of Soviet communications, and Fuchs confessed in 1950 and drew a 14-year sentence, of which he served 9. Historians credit his espionage with saving the Soviet atomic program at least a year of work. The largest secret in history carried a hole right through its middle, and that hole was a man everyone trusted. Everything now converged: Chicago and Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos, 3 years, $2 billion, 500,000 people, all of it narrowing down to a single steel tower in the New Mexico desert before dawn on the 16th of July, 1945. Oppenheimer himself chose the name Trinity for the test. Atop the tower sat the plutonium implosion design, the one that could not be trusted without a trial, the gadget, ringed by instruments and distant observers and the accumulated hope and dread of everyone who knew what was about to be attempted. Nearby loomed Jumbo, a massive steel containment vessel built to recover the precious plutonium should the bomb fail to detonate properly. And in the end, the planners grew confident enough that they never used Jumbo as intended. The scientists passed the waiting hours the way brilliant, anxious people often do, by betting. A pool ran on the yield, with guesses climbing from 0 to 45 kilotons, and Femi floated his darker wager on whether the blast might set the atmosphere alight. Femi also readied one of his signature improvisations, so that when the shockwave arrived he dropped small strips of paper and measured how far the blast shoved them, converting their motion into an on-the-spot estimate of the explosion's power. His quick figure landed near 10 kilotons, an underestimate, yet a stunning piece of instant physics from a man standing in the presence of the first nuclear explosion in history. At 45 seconds past 29 minutes after 5 in the morning, Mountain War time, the gadget detonated. The yield is one of those numbers where the sources genuinely clash, and honesty demands a range rather than a single confident figure. Contemporary and later estimates cluster anywhere from roughly 18 to 21 kilotons. Some references give 25 kilotons plus or minus 2, and a recent re-evaluation settles near 24.8 kilotons of TNT equivalent. What nobody disputes is that it worked, that the implosion design performed, that the plutonium road to a bomb was real, and that the world had changed. 2 reactions from that morning have outlived everyone who stood there. Oppenheimer, dated the 11th of June, 1945, it argued that using the bomb in a surprise attack on a Japanese city would be a moral and strategic error, and it pressed instead for a demonstration, a display of the weapon's power that might force surrender without the immediate slaughter. The interim committee, the body advising on the bomb's use, weighed the demonstration idea and rejected it on the 21st of June, 1945. Then came the petition. In July of 1945, Leo Szilard, the same man whose fear had launched the entire effort 6 years earlier, circulated a petition among the scientists that ultimately gathered dozens of signatures, somewhere between 67 and 88 across the sites. The Szilard petition asked President Truman not to use the bomb against Japan without first stating the terms of surrender publicly and giving Japan a chance to respond, and that petition never reached Truman before Hiroshima. Declassification did not come until 1961. At least one man walked away entirely, because Joseph Rotblat left the Manhattan Project in 1944 on grounds of conscience, the one scientist who formally departed for moral reasons while the work still continued. These appeals were aimed at President Harry Truman, who had inherited both the war and the bomb upon Roosevelt's death. Writing in his diary on the 25th of July, 1945, Truman described the discovery of the most terrible bomb in the history of the world, adding that it seemed the most terrible thing ever discovered, yet could be made the most useful. When he publicly announced the weapon's use on the 6th of August, Truman warned Japan to expect, if they refused to surrender, a rain of ruin from the air unlike anything ever seen on this earth. The gun-type uranium bomb, Little Boy, the design trusted so completely it had never been tested, fell on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, the plutonium implosion bomb, Fat Man, the same design proven at Trinity, fell on Nagasaki. The human toll, like the Trinity yield, is a place where precise numbers collapse and honesty demands ranges. At Hiroshima, immediate deaths are estimated somewhere between 66,000 and 80,000 people, with the toll rising to somewhere between 90,000 and 140,000 or more by the close of 1945, as injuries and radiation took hold. At Nagasaki, deaths by year's end commonly run from around 40,000 to 80,000. These figures remain uncertain even now, for the grim reason that the very infrastructure that would have counted the dead was itself destroyed. The bombs did not fall in isolation. On the 8th and 9th of August, 1945, in the window between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. On the 15th of August, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, and Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. The formal surrender was signed aboard the battleship USS Missouri on the 2nd of September, 1945, and the Second World War was over. The argument over why it ended, though, was only beginning, and it has never stopped since. Here stands the single most contested question in the entire history of the Manhattan Project, and any honest account has to present it as a genuine, unresolved debate rather than settled fact. Why did Japan surrender? And were the atomic bombs necessary to bring it about? The traditional view, call it the traditionalist school, holds that the bombs were necessary. In this account, the atomic bombings forced a surrender that would otherwise have demanded a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, an invasion certain to cost enormous numbers of lives on both sides. This view takes seriously the official explanation offered by Truman and by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and it points to Hirohito's own reference to the new and most cruel bomb in his surrender broadcast. Historians tied to versions of this position include Robert Maddox, Robert Newman, Richard Frank, and Wilson Miss Gamble. Standing against them is the revisionist school, most closely linked to the historian Garel Perovitz through his 1965 book Atomic Diplomacy and his 1995 work The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. The revisionist argument runs that Japan already hovered close to surrender in the summer of 1945, that the bombs therefore carried no military necessity, and that they were used at least partly for a different purpose, to intimidate the Soviet Union and shape the post-war world. Read this way, the opening shots of the Cold War were fired at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and historians such as Martin Sherwin and Ronald Takaki have argued versions of that case. A third position exists as well, sometimes called the Soviet Factor School, bound most tightly to the historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa and his 2005 book Racing the Enemy. Hasegawa argues that what truly drove Japan to surrender was not primarily the bombs but the Soviet declaration of war and the invasion of Manchuria on the 8th and 9th of August, that the collapse of Japan's hope for a negotiated peace brokered by a neutral USSR outweighed the destruction of two cities. Herbert Bix, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning work, has stressed instead the internal machinery of Japanese decision-making. And some historians reject the entire framing. Barton Bernstein has challenged both extremes, disputing the confident claim that Japan stood clearly ready to surrender anyway, while equally disputing the confident claim that an invasion would necessarily have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. And Bernstein questions the very bomb or invasion binary that so much of the debate simply assumes. This video will not pretend to settle the question. The certainty you so often hear, from every direction, is not warranted by the evidence, and the most defensible position may be that multiple forces converged in August of 1945, while clean single-cause explanations serve ideology far better than they serve history. Nowhere does the bomber invasion argument grow shakier than in the casualty estimates for the invasion that never came, and this deserves its own moment, because these numbers get hurled around as though they were established fact when they rank among the most disputed figures in the whole story. Estimates for the cost of a full invasion of Japan varied wildly, even at the time, even among the people whose job was to produce them. General George Marshall reportedly projected something on the order of 31,000 American casualties in the first 30 days of an invasion of Kyushu. The Joint Chiefs of Staff carried estimates reaching around 456,000 casualties for the initial operation, and figures approaching 1.2 million total casualties, including on the order of 267,000 dead. Admiral William Lee's estimates settled near 268,000. Memos tied to Herbert Hoover suggested 500,000 to 1 million fatalities, and later studies floated figures as high as 1.7 to 4 million American casualties, with 400,000 to 800,000 dead, alongside 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths. Truman and Stimson publicly cited figures climbing to 500,000 or even 1 million American lives saved, and revisionist historians argue those high numbers were inflated after the fact to justify a decision already made. One eerie piece of physical evidence surfaces often in this debate. The U.S. military manufactured around 500,000 Purple Heart medals in anticipation of the casualties of an invasion of Japan, a stockpile so vast it was reportedly still being drawn down to wound soldiers in wars fought decades later. Whatever the true figure would have proven to be, someone in 1945 expected enough American casualties to require 500,000 medals. The range here, from Marshall's 31,000 in the first month to post-war studies running into the millions, is so vast that it should make anyone wary of wielding invasion casualty numbers as a trump card in the moral argument. The honest statement is that nobody knew, that the estimate sprawled across 2 orders of magnitude, and that these disputed numbers cannot carry the moral weight so often piled onto them. One part of the Trinity story vanished entirely from the celebrations of 1945, and it ties the Manhattan Project to something we now understand very differently: environmental and public health risk, and the question of who ends up bearing it. The gadget detonated atop a tower roughly 30 meters above the desert floor, and the people living in the surrounding stretch of New Mexico were never evacuated. By the safety standards adopted just a few years afterward, that population should have been moved, and it was not, because the government's priority was secrecy and success rather than the health of the ranchers and families living downwind of the Jornada del Muerto. A study led by Sebastian Philippe of Princeton's program on science and global security, released in July of 2023, modeled the spread of radioactive fallout from Trinity and reached a startling conclusion: that fallout from that single New Mexico test deposited across much of the country, reaching 46 states within 10 days. According to that study, only Washington State and Oregon showed no deposition. A weapon tested in secret in one desert had scattered a measurable radioactive signature across nearly the entire continental United States within a week and a half. This is the cross-domain connection worth sitting with. The Manhattan Project usually gets filed under military history, or the history of physics, yet the story of the Trinity downwinders reads as an early chapter in something far more modern: the problem of technological externalities, the costs of a powerful new technology that never appear on the balance sheet of the people deploying it, landing instead on populations who never consented and were never told. The families of the Tularosa Basin, whose case was carried for years by advocates like Tina Cordova of the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, bore a cost that the project's $2 billion accounting never recorded. It is the same structural problem running through debates over industrial pollution, over data privacy, over any technology whose benefits gather in one place while its harms get exported to another. Among everything else it was, Trinity stands as one of the earliest and largest examples of that pattern in the modern age. The Manhattan Engineer District did not survive long past the war it was built to win. On the 1st of January, 1947, control of the American atomic program passed to a new civilian body, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the Army's improbable custody of the atomic bomb ended, though the consequences of what had risen at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos would run through the rest of the century and into our own. The three secret cities did not vanish. Oak Ridge and Los Alamos remain centers of American science to this day, while Hanford became something else entirely, the most radioactively contaminated site in the United States, where cleanup of the waste left by wartime and Cold War plutonium production grinds on even now, one of the most expensive and difficult remediation efforts ever undertaken. The people involved scattered into history. Oppenheimer became the public face of the atomic age, and later a casualty of its politics. Groves slipped back into the anonymity of a career soldier. Szilard, who had started it all with a letter and then tried to halt the bomb's use with a petition, spent his later years campaigning against the very weapons he had helped bring into being. Fuchs served his sentence and lived out his life in East Germany. And the Kalutran girls of Oak Ridge returned home to lives in which, for decades, few people believed what they had done during the war. In a final irony, an enterprise built in total secrecy became, in time, a national memorial. Late in 2014, legislation authorized the creation of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, formally established on the 10th of November, 2015, through an agreement between the National Park Service and the Department of Energy, spanning all three of the original secret sites, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. The places that officially never existed are now places you can visit. 80 years on, the Manhattan Project refuses to fade into quiet history, and the last few years have proven exactly that. In 2023, the story reached its largest audience in generations through Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer, adapted from the biography American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin. The film earned more than $976 million worldwide and took home 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor for Cillian Murphy. It sent a surge of tourism toward Los Alamos and the Trinity site, and it pushed the moral questions of 1945 back into a global conversation, the same questions the Frank Report and the Szilard petition had raised while the bomb was still being built. The human legacy, remarkably, is still being litigated in the present tense. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, first enacted in 1990 to compensate Americans harmed by radiation from the nuclear program, had lapsed by the middle of 2024. On the 4th of July, 2025, it was reauthorized and significantly expanded, and for the first time the law reached the New Mexico Trinity downwinders, the very people who had lived beneath that fallout cloud in July of 1945 and had gone uncompensated for 80 years. A device its makers called, almost tenderly, the gadget released the energy of nearly 25,000 tons of TNT before dawn on the 16th of July, 1945, and one of its makers thought of a line about becoming death, while another simply said what he felt, which was that they were all sons of bitches now. So here is the question this leaves behind, and it stays a question rather than an answer, because 80 years of historians have failed to turn it into one. If 500,000 people can build something that reshapes the world without most of them ever seeing what it truly was, and if we are still, right now, writing checks for the harm it caused and still arguing over whether it ever needed to happen, then how much of what we are building today, in our own secret and not-so-secret projects, will look the very same way to the people who inherit it? The Italian navigator landed in the New World inside a squash court in Chicago, and we have been living in that new world ever since. We still have not finished counting the cost.